It's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works in Korean and in English translations as well. This week we have with us a cultural essayist, Colin Marshall, who's also a host of his own podcast, Korean 한국, or Colin's Korea, and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. He joins us now in the studio. Colin, hello. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you, Jang-ho.
Okay, so Colin, you usually talk about Korean novels that have not yet been translated, but I understand that today you've brought for us a non-fiction Korean book that has not yet been translated, but it was also not written by a Korean.
That's true. It was written by an American. The book is 사랑받지 못하는 공화국, or The Unloved Republic, by the North Korea analyst Brian Myers, who's better known in the English-speaking world as B.R. Myers. And he's been living here in South Korea for well over 20 years now.
Yes, his name will be familiar to followers of Korean news, especially North Korean news, and regular listeners of our show as well. Myers, he's an American professor who lives here in South Korea, the Republic of Korea, but he is known for his work related to North Korea, as you said, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Indeed.
Now, the title of the book is 사랑받지 못하는 공화국, the Unloved Republic. Which of these two republics is he referring to then when he says it is unloved?
Right, at first you would imagine the title refers to North Korea,
right,
since Myers has, at this point, written almost exclusively about that country. He's a North Korea analyst. His best-known book in the U.S. is a study of North Korean propaganda called The Cleanest Race, How North Koreans See Themselves and Why It Matters. And that book caught my own attention when it was first published back in 2010, because I was hosting a radio show in California at that time, and I invited Myers on for a phone interview to discuss the book. And like many Americans, I was fascinated by North Korea, which appeared to be such an odd and forbidding exception to the global geopolitical order. And like not quite so many Americans, I was studying the Korean language at the time, and I was eager to talk to a Westerner who'd learned it himself and was putting it to use in his career as a public intellectual. Now, since then, it's been more than a decade. Myers has been one of the few Western North Korea observers whose writing I trust, not least because he speaks and reads Korean.
Right.
Right, a set of skills that some listeners may be surprised to learn aren't so common among the global North Korea commentariat.
Yes, some would say, concerningly so.
That's true. I would certainly say that. Naturally, I got in touch with Brian Myers again when I first visited Korea a few years later, and I came to produce a series of interview podcasts. Myers was the first guest with whom I recorded, and in fact, he was the first foreigner in Korea I ever met.
Wow,
so
okay.
I wanted to get his views on not North Korea that time, the second time, but South, to hear what he'd learned about life on this side of the 38th parallel, of which he actually has experience going back to when he was a language student in Seoul in the 1980s. And it's that experience, that long experience, he brings to bear on 사랑받지 못하는 공화국, the Unloved Republic, of whose title is, in fact, South Korea.
Okay, so that is interesting for those who follow his writings online. They will know that he does have a lot to say about South Korea as well. I'm sure they'd be interested to get his insights on South Korea as well. But the Unloved Republic, that sounds like a somewhat counterintuitive declaration, given how much positive attention South Korea has received across the world in recent years, and even more so given the kind of opinions expressed around the world about North Korea.
On the whole, of course, there can be no question about which Korea enjoys the more favorable reputation. But what Myers is getting at has more to do with the feelings toward the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea, this country, of South Koreans themselves. Now, to claim that South Koreans don't love their country would sound bizarre to many foreigners. If you ask people in the United States of America to list what they see as the main characteristics of Koreans, I have no doubt one of the most common answers would be patriotism. Right. Koreans are patriotic. They love Korea. And I have no doubt as well that a great many Koreans regard themselves as patriots. But in Myers' view, the people of South Korea and the people of the United States have different conceptions of what constitutes patriotism, broadly speaking. South Korean patriotism, as he sees it, often doesn't involve love for the Republic of Korea per se, that is, for South Korea as a political entity.
Okay, I think for people who have spent time in Korea, this will actually start to ring a little bit true, I feel. But patriotism, it is a rather abstract concept. Does Myers point to any sort of example of how this difference manifests itself in Korean life?
He does. He has plenty. And early in the book, he points out something that Americans may find shocking. For a bit of background, Brian Myers has long been a professor at Dongso University down in Busan. And he's made a habit of asking his Korean students there if they know when their country, the Republic of Korea, Daehanminguk, was founded. And fewer than 1 out of 10 can come up with the right answer. It's not just that they don't say August 15th, 1948, in the way an American would instinctively say July 4th, 1776, but that they're uncertain even about the year. Their guesses range, they span a whole range of about 5 millennia. And not long ago, I was having dinner with an English friend, a professor here in Seoul, and a couple of his former students. He and I got to talking about Myers' book and this claim that very few Koreans know when South Korea was founded. So he suggested we put the question to the Koreans, his students who were there. And sure enough, when we asked them if they knew when the Republic of Korea was founded, they looked at us like we'd asked them the distance between the moon and the sun. There was just incomprehension. Later that evening, when we were in a cab, that professor friend asked the 70-something driver if he knew when the Republic of Korea was founded. The man waffled a bit about how he was sure he'd learned it back in Gugminhakyo, but the memory has become a bit hazy since then, and to his credit, he finally admitted that he didn't know. An American who hears all this will surely think, how can these ultra-patriotic South Koreans possibly be ignorant of the year of their country's foundation?
Well, I think some snobby Europeans might say that there isn't much history to learn about America in the first place, so it's easier. I'm not saying that's me, but some might say that.
There are such types, yeah.
But joking aside, actually, it could be the fact that when Koreans learn about the nation's history, it's not just the modern era that's studied. So you could say August 15th, 1948, as you said, but Korean history broadly defined stretches back far more than that, as you said, up to possibly 5 millennia. So we're talking, I guess, about students who've had to memorize that kind of ancient history as well, king after king in the Joseon era and such, which is different from, I guess, US students who have to learn about American history.
Very much so. Yeah. This is not a country that just goes back, not a society that just goes back 75 years. And much has been written by Myers and others about the troubles of teaching history in South Korea. There's the sheer quantity of it, as you say, but there's also the matter of which chapters of history are emphasized in the curriculum, or even admitted to the curriculum, and which not. I remember, shortly after I first came to Korea, a decade ago, witnessing protests about the potential revision of history textbooks, something you don't see in the United States, not so much. I've also heard that students hoping to study Korean history in graduate school often receive the paradoxical-sounding advice to apply to an institution outside Korea to study Korean history. Part of that has to do with the way history remains a fraught, politicized subject here in this country, one that some imagine could delegitimize the state itself. But Myers also sees something deeper going on here, which we discussed in our interviews, and he develops further in 사랑받지 못하는 공화국. He uses the framework of historical cultures and ahistorical cultures.
Okay.
An example of the former is ancient Egypt, whose people saw themselves as always inhabiting a specific point on a well-defined, recorded continuum of time. And an example of the latter is ancient Greece, where people would draw 100-year contracts and not even bother to date them. And Myers categorizes Korea as an ancient Greece-like ahistorical culture, where the events of the past coalesce into a sort of body of myth not long after they occur. And this is another phenomenon he first identified through interactions with his students, who could recount particular episodes of Korean history, usually mixed in with the artistic liberties of movies and TV dramas, but never paint the whole chronological picture, the story of Korean history, no matter in how broad the strokes.
Well, I mean, I guess it may be that the average Korean has less less of a grasp on history than perhaps foreigners might imagine. But surely the same could be said about many other countries around the world. Does Myers identify any real consequences of this sort of ahistorical mindset, as he calls it? He
points to it as one factor that contributes to the South Korean lack of what he calls 국가 정신, or state spirit. And this is what lies behind certain geopolitical phenomena, also inexplicable to Americans, such as the muted South Korean reaction to the sinking of the warship Jonan and the bombardment of Yeonpyeong Island, both in 2010. And all evidence points to these actions having been committed by North Korea, causing the loss of lives in both cases. But how did South Korea respond? With sanctions, nothing harsher than that. And here, the public seem to regard these incidents not as attacks, but as regrettable accidents, best forgotten, the mistakes of a wayward brother. One major factor here, in Myers' view, is the official emphasis placed on belonging first, not to a 공화국, or republic, but to a 민족, or a people. And if the value of the Republic of Korea is rooted less in liberal democracy than in the Korean race and its long history, it's only natural that when push comes to shove, South Koreans would hesitate to draw a hard line between their own country and North Korea, much less to see it as a threat. And all this reminds me of the first Korean joke I ever heard about what a wife does when she finds out her husband is cheating on her.
Okay.
In Russia, the wife shoots him. In America, she sues him. That's particularly perceptive. In Korea, she blames the government. And that punchline, so I've come to realize, reflects a kind of public assumption here that everything good owes to the Korean people, whereas everything bad is the fault of the Korean state.
Right, okay. I'm not sure how true that sentiment is, but I guess Koreans often talk about how little trust they have in politicians and politics.
Of course.
And yet, also interestingly, because democracy in Korea was so hard fought, voting turnout has always been quite high. But then again, that leads to the perpetual disappointment in the state as well, I guess. So Myers here, he's looking at not just South Korea, it seems, but also the relationship with South Korea in this book as well, going back to his expertise. So does Myers himself have any blame to lay as such? Who, in his analysis, is perhaps responsible for this sort of deficit of the state spirit?
We might call Brian Myers an equal opportunity political critic. He indicts the Korean left for their credulous tendency to take North Korea at its word, even when that word is obvious propaganda, and the Korean right for their complacent belief that the U.S. will always be willing and able to come to South Korea's defense, just as the South Vietnamese once believed, as Brian Myers adds a sort of aside in this book. These factors and others besides have made for a certain difficulty in South Korea's standing confidently on its own 2 feet, we could say. We should remember Myers didn't write 사랑받지 못하는 공화국 in Korean by accident. It's his first book in Korean, and it's a book meant to communicate directly with Korean readers. And what may give those Korean readers pause, more than any of his arguments, is the question he asks toward the very end. And as the Republic of Korea, this half of the peninsula became an unprecedented economic success story. The so-called Miracle on the Han River turned one of the poorest nations in the world into one of the richest, and did it quickly. And now it's one of the most respected nations as well. And there are, of course, no end of valid criticisms South Koreans make of their own society today. But if a republic that can accomplish all that has no right to expect love, then, Myers asks, what republic does?
Well, it certainly sounds like a book that raises very interesting questions for the South Korean people, and it'd be interesting to get a Korean person's perspective on the book as well at some point. But Colin, what about for Western readers? Do you think there is value in this book for Western readers if a version was ever to come out in English as well?
I've been a long-time Brian Myers fan. I've read all his work in English. He's a good writer, as well as being an astute, I think, analyst. He's controversial, of course, but often because he cuts to the heart of the matter. And if he were to rewrite this book in English, I think it would rank with the rest of his books as well. But it's so targeted toward Koreans. He really wants to speak to the Korean people and say, I'm not some Westerner. I don't want to be some Westerner saying, you have to do this, you have to do that. He says, in fact, I think I love the Republic itself more than you do. Here's why it should be loved, or why it would help Korea's place in the world if it were loved. And he has some suggestions, but I think he's diagnosing a problem many Koreans haven't thought about. There have been other things to think about.
Sure.
And so that's the target audience here, but I think Western readers of his, like me, would enjoy it in either language.
Well, in any case, it sounds like a fascinating book indeed, from a fascinating mind. Once again, it's called 사랑받지 못하는 공화국, The Unloved Republic by Brian Myers. And that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, thank you once again for introducing us to another interesting book, and we look forward to the next one. Till then, take care.
See you again soon, Jang-ho.
And that'll be all from us here on Korea24. We'll be back same time tomorrow, so we hope you join us again then. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.